Hello, welcome to another episode of GBLOC's Go Deeper podcast series. My name is Sheila, and I am the Community and Program Director here at GBLOC. And it is my absolute pleasure to tell you about our guest today, Jeffrey Bowman. So Jeffrey is the CEO of Reframe Incorporated, co-founder of Reframe AI Technologies and Reframe Consulting Services. He's an inventor and pioneer of a change operating system and inclusive experience design approach that helps leaders accelerate inclusive change and growth at scale. He is also a two-time award-winning Wiley published author, and his work has been featured in the New York Times, Economist, Fast Company, NBC, and Fortune, to name a few. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to this conversation, and hopefully, the members get something out of it.
Absolutely, I'm looking forward to diving in with you. So we start with our first question. Tell us your why. Why do you do what you do, and what do you consider your purpose or your mission?
So my why is really about making the next generation better, and hopefully they're not having some of the same conversations that we're currently having as it relates to diverse equity and inclusion. And so my overall purpose is to help leaders accelerate what we call inclusive change and growth. Not only accelerate, but also operationalize inclusive change and growth. And so we invented this change approach that modernizes both multicultural marketing and DE&I as a practice, not the topic, but the practice. And so when we think about that as a country, a nation, a world, a lot of it has some historical context as to why things are the way they are today, not only just in the Western, but the Eastern hemisphere as well, and Southern. And so the idea with what I do is that, whether it's, we've been in business now for 10 years, if it takes us another 10 years, we have introduced an approach, we've validated the approach with over, 40 Fortune 500 companies. And now our goal is to scale it through software, piece of proprietary software that we develop, and hopefully get some traction, and we eradicate this conversation so that the next generation can focus on bigger things.
I hear you on that, and I hope that is what exactly happens. So so tell me, what is the one big idea you would like to offer this community, and why?
Yeah, I when I get asked that question around the big idea, I think anytime you have a conversation around this topic of change, you're going to have anti and pro, no matter what. I think the big idea is to remain open. And if you don't see a solve, go out and build the solve. And oftentimes, I think because of the historical context of a topic or a thing like DE&I or multicultural, we sometimes lose perspective, like those practices too have to shift and change. And so for the community in itself, yes, there is a defensible approach to old, but we should remain open to new, given the shift that's happening in the world today.
Yeah. I really appreciate openness. I think that's massive, especially with this conversation, which can be so complex and have so many so many layers. So yeah, I think that's a huge one, and especially learning to have conversations. I think openness is so important, especially when you're having uncomfortable conversations and talking about things that aren't so like clean, I want to say. And I think it helps us stay in the conversation, which is incredibly important. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So in your world, what are the ways in which you cultivate meaningful connection?
Cultivate meaningful connection. I think when I'm in a room, whether it's a room with people that I've known for a number of years, new people that I've yet to meet, I'm always curious in terms of who that person is. So oftentimes, a conversation may go me introducing myself first,
Mm.
and then really getting an understanding of who they are. It's almost like I mean, so one little secret about our business is that, when we did a lot of the research in terms of the old, we begin to say, okay, what's missing? It's almost
Mm.
like, you know, I got a question when I was at Ogilvy, a question by the CEO, and John Seifert asked me, I was just coming into the agency business from the brand business. If David Ogilvy were here, what would the agency look like? And this
Mm.
is in like 2009. And, I had to go all the way back to the 1940s and 50s in terms of creation of corporations. And
Wow.
so, and then the demographics, specifically within the US, there's a hard document that gets published every 10 years called the census. And so when you look at the US at that particular time in the 1950s and 60s, the US was less than 10% racially, ethnically diverse.
Mm.
Less than 10%. So it's actually like 8% 1960 census. And so when you think about that, like, wow, these guys are actually making a decision. They were making the right business decisions at that time because minorities had not become the majority. And, you have to pay attention to the mass, to the people that actually have the money, right?
Hmm.
From a commercial standpoint, doesn't mean socially, culturally, it was the right thing to do, but business wise,
Mm.
that's what it was. And
Right.
so, given the fact that the question was right around the 2010 census, you saw the shift. And so, the reason I say that is because with each relationship that I try and establish, I try and get to learn more about them, their
Mm.
past, how they grew up, where they grew up, who they grew up with. And then you begin to see a narrative in terms of who they are. And it
Mm.
dresses them down too, because rarely do people get asked about who they are, right? It's almost like an
Yeah.
interview. Not
Yeah.
like an interview in corporate America, but like a
Yeah.
one-on-one stakeholder interview, like getting it down. And so that's typically where I start.
Yeah.
And over the course of that relationship, they'll forget about all those things. It's like the airplane, right? You're in an airplane and they tell you everything,
Yeah.
right? And then they forget that they told you everything. And so over time, you begin to have more meaningful conversations because you now have a way of connecting with them on a much more deeper and personal
That's that is brilliant. I am taking that.
level.
I will say I am also a very curious person.
Yeah.
So I definitely ask a lot of questions to really get to know who someone is. But that's a yeah, it's getting me to think about how I can what kind of questions I could ask to really learn about someone's history a little bit more. And even when I'm meeting someone to think about like someone's potential historical context and how that influences
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
they
Whether,
are.
you know, their city, you think about what most people, I'm from the South.
Hmm.
And so South Carolina specifically, and you think about South Carolina, it's the coastal, you have the Geechee, the Gullah, but industry down there was more tourism, agriculture, and military.
Mm.
Middle of the state, government, education, health, and agriculture. Upstate, much more manufacturing based. You have two interstate highways, 26 and 85. So, as you begin to look at how people grew up, you can kind of understand the social economic, and it's not just US, it's all over the world in terms of where
A
people are
hundred
coming from.
percent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Um, so what contributions do you make through through your work or outside of your work that is meaningful to you?
So that's a great question in terms of contributions. Um, we, meaning myself, you know, my journey was a 30-year journey to kind of get me to where I'm at today, right?
Mm,
And so there are no overnight, successes.
yeah.
And so I think in terms of impact, I was afforded the opportunity to start literally on the back of a Pepsi truck and work my way up. And
Mm,
so as I worked my way up, I began to see and experience inequities
mm,
associated with the workplace and the marketplace, how companies and organizations underfund initiatives, different groups, whether it be clusters of people that um, you know U.S. specifically is census based, but as you go more on the global base, there's race, there's age, there's origin in terms of where people were from, in terms of where they originated. But I like to think my contribution is to like advance that next generation, and I think the era in which I grew up was like Gen 2 post civil rights, right?
mm,
And I reference the U.S. specifically, because of where I'm from, right? And so, the 1970 was the first real year of integration where people begin to graduate from high school.
mm,
1980, I graduated from high school in the 80s. So I'm
yeah.
Gen 2 post civil rights, right?
Yeah.
And so when you think about the contributions in itself, um, you know, I would hope my tombstone reads, um, you know, we advance and help solve a decades old problem. And that
Mm,
is this idea of practicing purely based on census, right? Whereas
hmm
now we're in this age of attitude and behavior based outcomes. And so when you think about a lot of the tension that exists, they're more attitude and behaviorally based. And so
mm,
how do you then begin to unpack that to where you begin to cluster those attitudes and behaviors and you treat those attitudes and behaviors,
mm.
irrespective of their race and identity? Now, it doesn't mean we exclude it, but
No.
how do we level up? Because the
Mm,
next thing is neural based, right? And so if we're still talking about race and identity, ethnicity as the entry point, man, I like to say we're 2 to 3 generations behind culturally,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because culture, most people don't understand the human element as it relates to social science. There's
Mm,
monocultural, multicultural, cross, poly, and trans. And
right.
so
Right.
that's where we need to take the conversation. And hopefully
Mm,
that's my contribution. I like to say to people, anytime you hear the word cross cultural within marketing communications, that ties back to me.
mm.
Um, I introduced a social science theory, created an operating system as to how do you glean those cross cultural and polycultural insights. And so that's
Incredible.
the contribution as a whole.
That's amazing. Um, so the next question I have is, what communities are you part of and why? How do they add value to your life?
Oh man, that's a interesting question at this time in this stage of my life. I had and this is gonna not be about business, right? But I think balance is important. Transparency is important. So one of the communities I belong to is Summit.
Hmm
It's great. What started off as something where you had a group of people who wanted to make impact in terms of environmentally, socially. You know, started off as a great group. Had a little bit of a bump, but now
hmm
it's ramping back up, like most organizations do as they grow and mature. And Soul House is another group that I belong to for some adult fun, right?
Yeah.
And you end up meeting a lot of different people, right?
Yeah.
In terms of community, um, not only just in New York City, but in different places and spaces that I go to. So that's on the more personal side. On the professional side, you know, GBLOC, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's important to, you know, understand different ways of thinking outside of the US. So I think it's really important to have
Yep.
that. Association of National Advertisers, SHRM, more industry in terms of, recently Campaign Magazine recognized myself and others in terms of 40 over 40. I guess that means I'm in the geriatric club when it comes to advertising and marketing, but I'm okay with that, right?
Hey, with
Um,
age comes wisdom. Hopefully,
age
we need
comes
more
with stuff.
wise people in this
Yeah,
world. So,
absolutely, absolutely. And then, I also, family's important to me in terms of my daughters.
mm,
Um, I'm learning and entering a new space. I'm, newly divorced, single. So for me, it's just not on the apps. Not going to do that.
yeah, that's okay if you are too.
No, 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 no. Not ready for that yet. But so no, those are just to give you a sample how I curate different groups based on my
Mm,
interests and likes.
I love that. So if you were running G Block for a day,
Hmm.
what would you do with the community and why?
What would I do with the community and why? Um, I think with G Block being fairly new, I would likely have um, a full day of why,
Mm, okay.
right?
Yep.
Um, I think over time, as I've gotten more familiar with the content, the people, um, almost like an onboarding day that happens 30 minutes. And it may
Mm,
already exist. Just at the beginning of the month, YG Block, and hosted by different people and make it a little bit more not only informative but relatable in terms of some of the things that people may or may not be going through.
yeah.
That's what I would do.
Yeah. Why G Block? I'm writing that down. That I like that. I like that idea.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so we're coming to a close. So is there anything else you'd like to share with the community?
I think we're approaching on the back half of the year. If you haven't started as a community planning for 2025, now is the time. And what I like to do sometimes on Sundays or Mondays is not a vision board, but kind of how would I make the what impact do I want to make on the world,
Mm,
and how am I living up or living down to that? And
mm,
so that's the thing that I would leave with the community in terms of inspiring because you know quiet is great. That's when something or somebody talks to you, and that's
mm.
really where you get the inner voice
Yep.
to make change happen. And don't be afraid of it.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to say thank you so much for your time and sharing all your insights, your wisdom, your story. We're so
Yeah,
grateful to have you be part of the community. And yeah, we'll end it there.
thank you so much. I really
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
All right.
Yeah.